mouse wants to play.
I'm streaming. Oh, here we go.
Yeah.
Okay. It's funny how the drop frames. This is probably a good exercise because the drop frames go from like 50% to down to 1 or 2, but it takes at least a minute
Oh, for it to come back.
for it to get to stop dropping frames. So I don't know if that's a.
I'm gonna stay on for the moment.
And you sit down.
Yeah.
That's the bad thing about Zoom.
No, it's not.
Well, I'm talking about like for meetings. It's like you're locked in front of a computer, sitting down the whole time.
I would take that over being in the office.
Yeah, it's funny. Every time I start to complain about Zoom, I'm like, wait.
Yeah.
Be careful what you wish for.
Well, that's
Yeah.
true for sure.
As someone that has to go in the office. I want to know how to go on Instagram Live. I don't know. I mean, I can figure out, but
Oh, my phone's not set up to do that.
I see.
I just have to go in the settings and do all the permissions.
Okay, so your volume is set where it has to be, right?
Yeah, it's set
So
at the highest it
if
can be.
it's too low, I gotta do it right here.
Mm-hmm.
It's looking pretty good though. Say a couple words.
Check 1, 2, 7, 35, 10, 54,
And that's middle.
7, 6, so super. Bebop. All right, happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to Drumversations. As usual, we want to take some time to breathe and honor our ancestors. We've got a lot to dig into with this contract of for Black America by Ice Cube and others. So take some time. Let's breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. As we breathe in all the goodness the universe has for us, and breathe out all the crazy anxiety and stuff that keeps us from being our best. Breathe in, breathe out. All right, we'll honor our ancestors. Type them in the chat, and we'll call their names after we play the ancestral drum call. Ashe. So, we honor all the ancestors, named and unnamed, born and those not yet born, because they help us remember who we are, especially when so much stuff is coming at us that seeks to disrupt who we are and who we think we are, both individually, culturally, and as a nation. Speaking of that, today we're continuing our conversation about the contract with Black America that was put out by Ice Cube and a group of scholars and his team. There's been a ton of controversy even since we discussed this last week. And so I want to be very clear about what the news is saying and what the contract is saying. Last week I did an overview. This week we'll do a more in-depth dive. I just want to say at the outset that one of the most important abilities we have as human beings is the ability to exchange ideas through conversation, books, art, music, and the like. It's not always about whether or not we agree, but it's about the respectful consideration of ideas, right? And so here's an idea that was put out. It's one that I happen to, after having gone through all of it, disagree with on a lot of levels. But this has also become something I think is necessary in discussing this contract in the context of other plans that are out, that have been out. So next week we'll be looking at, I think, Chancellor Williams' plan in his book, Destruction of the Black Civilization. And it's a plan to revitalize Black culture, Black America, that's been out for some years, that I think, that along with some other plans, Claude Anderson's 400-year economic plan and Powernomics, and Dr. Amos Wilson's plan, or what he calls blueprint for Black Power. These things are, if we are serious about, not just repairing Black America, but envisioning a new America. These are things that we seriously have to understand and consider, because that work has already been done. So we don't always have to reinvent the wheel, right? So it's in that context that I am reviewing this. So at the outset of the piece, the preface, Derek Hamilton, who's director still of the current institute at OSU, but in January will become the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy and University Professor at the New School. He's returning to the New School next year, writes that this contract with Black America seeks to strike the heart of racism and present a blueprint to achieve racial and economic justice in the context of George Floyd and the global pandemic, in which the Black mortality rate is more than double that of white mortality rate, and 45% or nearly half of Black businesses have been closed as a result of the pandemic. He also writes that the impact of something presumably random, such as a pandemic, however catastrophic, can be linked to one's racial identity, is problematic and further evidence that as a nation we have failed, or we are failing miserably. But he doesn't explain what we're failing at, right? And that's one of the things about this document that's problematic, because it says something that sounds like it's going to be really good, but it never actually completes the statement, so we have clarity about what they're talking or speaking to, right? So we're failing in a lot of ways, right? And America's not just failing Black people. America is failing poor folks. America is failing women in a lot of ways. America is failing especially Black women, Black trans. I mean, there are all kind of different groups of folks, people who are physically disabled, mentally, not, quote unquote normal, right? That have medical issues of all sorts, right? So we're failing in a lot of ways. So when it says America is failing, what does he really mean by that? I don't know. And then he says, this is not an, I'm sorry. He says, authentic agency is grounded in resources, meaning capital, economics, right? And America's unjust racial wealth gap is rooted in a history that has privileged white people with financial advantages to buy crucial, additional, and intergenerational advantage for themselves and their children. And while, yes, there is absolutely a racial wealth gap, um, authentic agency is not grounded in capital or access to capital alone. So, right at the beginning of this piece, they are presenting a very narrowly defined scope for how they think America can engage and solve the racial wealth gap and other problems facing Black America. So I want to make sure that that's clear. It's very narrowly defined. So if we're looking for a plan, this is not a plan. This is a contract, right? And as contracts go, it's narrowly defined on closing the racial wealth gap, on criminal justice reform, and things like that, education, right? So that's what we're going to be dealing with today. I also then want to call out one other discrepancy in this preface. I mean, and my notes are all over the page. So I'm just not going through all of them. I'm hitting the highlights. Derek Hamilton writes that, excuse me, this contract rejects the racist and unsubstantiated rhetoric that ignorance, so-called grit, and personal responsibility are the sources of racial disparity, along with the accompanying neoliberal paternalism model in which government attempts to coerce or incentivize insinuated defective Black people to behave accordingly and make better decisions. That's a key phrase in this document that is really saying that we reject respectability politics and we reject blaming the victim, right? I'm calling that out so you put a pin in that. I'll read it one more time because we're going to get to something here in a second where it's going to be completely antithetical to what this statement says and seeks to do. And then we have to reconcile what the document is trying to do. Again, in the preface to the whole contract with Black America, this is the second to the last paragraph. Derek Hamilton writes, this contract rejects the racist and unsubstantiated rhetoric that ignorance, so-called grit, and personal responsibility are the sources of racial disparity, along with the accompanying neoliberal paternalism model in which government attempts to coerce or incentivize insinuated defective Black people to behave accordingly and make better decisions. Yeah.
Ancestors.
Oh, we have some ancestors. We'll always stop to honor ancestors.
Ruby Lynn Cox.
Ruby Lynn Cox, Ashe.
William Daniel Cox.
William Daniel Cox, Ashe.
Willis D. Sanders Jr.
Willis D. Sanders Jr., Ashe.
Everly Sanders.
Everly Sanders, Ashe.
Frank and Verna Lomax.
I'm sorry, excuse me. Frank and Verna Lomax, Ashe.
David and Philip Lomax.
David and Philip Lomax, Ashe.
Norma Thomas.
Norma Thomas, Ashe.
Ed Bell.
Ed Bell, Ashe.
Edna Bell.
Edna Bell, Ashe.
Charles Bell.
Charles Bell, Ashe.
William Bell.
William Bell, Ashe.
George Bell.
George Bell, Ashe.
Mike Bell.
Mike Bell, Ashe.
Patricia Bell.
Patricia Bell, Ashe.
Larry Baker Jr.
Larry Baker Jr., Ashe.
John and Franny Brandon.
John and Franny Brandon, Ashe. Ashe-o, Ashe-o. So he's making, Derek, in this preface, a very explicit point that one of the purposes of this agenda, of this, contract, is to do away with respectability politics, right? And that by increasing the economic agency of Black America, we then will have a pathway to achieve racial and economic justice. In fact, he says, this contract with Black America is a patriotic pathway to promote our shared prosperity and achieve racial economic justice. There are a lot of issues in the preface. If you haven't yet read it, I encourage you to read it because, we could spend a whole day just on this alone, but I want to get through this larger piece. The next section is a contract with Black America addressing racial inequality. and it says Black Americans have had enough with gradual reform in a nation that prides itself as the world's greatest democracy. So, you know me, I'm a word guy. I take issue with that because there's been a lot of scholarship that says America never has and never was intended to be a democracy. Now, granted, a lot of this research in recent years, since about 2015, 2016, I've even seen some articles back to 2014 coming out of conservative think tanks like the Heritage Foundation and others. But you also see, which could also be seen as moderate, conservative, somewhat maybe neoliberal, depending on who the professor is, work coming out of Yale and Harvard that says the same thing. And so, again, who is this document talking to? Because if it's talking to Black America, the folks that follow Cube, these kinds of nuanced definitions and delineations are important, in terms of what actually is a democracy and what was the plan initially for America to be. Representative democracy or republic is different than democracy for the sake of democracy, right? Democracy means majority rule. If we were a true democracy, Trump could not be president right now because he lost the popular vote, right? So the will of the people, by 3 million votes, overwhelmingly said Hillary Clinton. But we have institutions and apparati in place that prevent us from being fully or wholly democratic, right? The Electoral College and even the Congress itself, right? So the House of Representatives is the house where, if you look at the history of legislation that's come through the House, it's been actually very radical and humane based on what we've seen come out of the Congress, right? And so the Congress is in effect like the British House of Lords, and the House of Representatives is in effect like the House of Commons in British Parliament. House of Commons represents the people, the common people. The House of Lords represents the aristocrats, right? Same thing. Here, Congress represents the wealthy elite. The House of Representatives represents the people. So there is legislation that happens in the House of Representatives, which is a part of that representative democracy, right? We elect people who go and make decisions on our behalf, right? And then it goes to the Congress, and often it dies there, right? So there's a part of this where there's a request that there is an apology from America to Black America for slavery and other such issues of discrimination, Jim Crow, all that kind of stuff. Well, that happened, right? In 2008, there was a resolution from the House of Representatives apologizing for slavery and Jim Crow. It did not get ratified by Congress, right? And then, oh snap, I can't remember the date, but I think I wrote it down way back in my notes. I have pages and pages of notes for this discussion, but Bill Clinton actually apologized for the Tuskegee experiment, right? So we have had some apologies, but to what end and what happened as a result, right? Nothing actually happened. It was just words. So again, the document kind of hits some things, but it misses a lot of things, right? So we have to understand what a democracy is and what our political context actually is in order for this statement to make sense, right? We might be appealing in this contract to something that does not exist, which means it has no utility. That's what I'm getting at. It goes on to say in this section that one of the points is to create a harmonious society that benefits everyone rather than the more radical alternative, which is watching the great American experiment come apart at the seams. So that's why they say this is a patriotic document, because they think that doing this work will save America by repairing Black America as an extent. And I don't necessarily disagree with that, right? NPR in September on the 23rd released an article that said the cost of racism is $16 trillion since 2000, since the year 2000. So if you're thinking purely economically, right, a $16 trillion deficit over the last 20 years as a result of discrimination is hugely significant. And if those resources would have been applied the right way, I agree that there's a lot that could have been done for the people. But what this contract also does not address is the fact that those resources are not applied in the right way, right? So even in the context of a reparations, right, that doesn't solve everything. I'm for reparations, but it doesn't solve everything. So what we'll see in these next sections is that we have to believe or agree in the contract or in the context of the contract that reparations is a foregone conclusion, because most of the other recommendations are about equality and not equity, right? There's a difference. Equality means that a millionaire and a thousandaire could both get $1 million, right? That's equal. But in that equal situation, the millionaire just becomes a 2 millionaire and the thousandaire becomes a 1 million, 1,000aire, right? So that wealth gap still exists equally from before the thousandaire became a millionaire to when the thousandaire becomes a millionaire. That gap still is the same. It did not close. Equity suggests that we tell the millionaire, hey, you're a millionaire. You're good, right? We need to now focus on the needs of these folks that don't have the same economic wherewithal that you have and bring them up so that they can be self-sufficient economically in a way that we define, right? So we're not taking away the millionaire's money, but we might also not be really keen on making sure that that millionaire has the same access they have had to make another million, because that's what created the racial wealth imbalance in the first place. It doesn't mean that they're no longer competitive. It just means that they have to compete on a equitable playing field, right? That's the difference. And a lot of people think it's about taking resources away. It's not. It's just leveling the playing field through equity, not equality, to bring folks up to play the game where other folks have been playing for 400 years, right? And this document does not address that. So the very first bullet pointed section is called Black Opportunity and Representation, and it really does focus on reparations first. And a lot of this reparations language comes from William Darity's research that you can find in From Here to Equality. So if you have not read that book, if you've not heard him do lectures about that book and about the idea of reparations, I suggest you check William Darity out, Darity, From Here to Equality. So you check that out. I don't have to go through all of his ideas to make this make sense. The key point about reparations is that they don't use the term reparations, and they say Black America will be compensated for the value of work contributed by their ancestors, while Native Americans will get back the true value or land promised to them in various treaties. And the way you do that, you have to, as an African American, you have to prove through documentations that you descend from at least one enslaved person, or you have to prove that you have identified as Black or African American for 10 years. That's all from William Darity, right? And they go into what that could look like in the back. We'll get to that. I'm just kind of hitting the high points right here. And then they talk about affirmative action in schools based on the national population of Black people at 13.4%, which again is parity and not equity, right? When you are trying to heal and repair, then you have to think about equity, not equality. So the question becomes, as they hit all these points with a lens about equality, that why should we think that that's going to work in the favor of people who have a 400-year sideline? We've been sidelined from enfranchisement in the economy for 400 years. So equality is not going to repair, and it's not going to do the work that they argue in this document needs to be done, should be done, and can be done through this line of thinking, right? So that, to me, is one of the huge faults of this document, is that it's more about equality than it is about equity, right? It does hit an issue of funding for schools, and it says that funding for schools should be per student funding and not funded through property taxes, right? Most of the developed nations of the world fund their schools through a per student type of apparatus, not a property tax. Property tax funding for schools has been deemed to be unconstitutional because the property taxes based on redlining and how that has historically devalued properties in certain neighborhoods, particularly neighborhoods that are black and brown majorities, means that the schools in those areas do not get the same amount of funding that schools in other areas that are majority white and have higher property taxes because there's a higher income base there get. So a school, to take Columbus for an example, a school in Bexley that has a relatively high tax base, income base, it gets X amount more money than a school that is 3 blocks away in Columbus, right? And that's because of the inconsistent way that we have aligned funding practices through racialized ideals and beliefs, right? So they do hit that. I do agree with that. And I think based on just what's here, that makes sense. But all of this still assumes that reparations has been passed and has gone through at a level of about $19 trillion over 10 years through various delivery mechanisms, whether it's tax breaks, free education, all these other kind of things. And they outline that, and we'll go through that. But that's a huge assumption. And the reason why I have a problem with that assumption is that we can change school funding without reparations, right? Again, I'm not against reparations, but everything in this document assumes that reparations happens, and it assumes that because of reparations, that we then, as Black Americans, are whole. Again, a very narrow argument, right? If I have experienced trauma because of racism, and you give me $1 million, I'm just a traumatic millionaire, right? Nothing's been done to help me really understand how I am valued and can become healthy, happy, and whole as a human being because I now have money in the bank, right? It goes back to the whole Dave Chappelle sketch where reparations happened and, everybody went out and bought Cadillacs, bowling balls, and opened up recording studios. It's a joke, but you got to think, if you give people who have not historically had access to resources a ton of resources, they're the same people. Nothing changed, right? So there are a few of us who have levels of financial literacy and we'll save that money, we'll invest that money, but there are so many more of us who haven't had access to those resources or that education, and we will do what people do. When you finally get some money, you go buy everything you ever wanted, and then you get put back in the same place, right? Except now you got more stuff. So that's, again, why this is a very limited document. They talk about bank lending and finance reform, and they say capitalism is a good system. I am not against markets. I'm not against selling of goods and actually sale of services to generate income. But capitalism as a system has done more to harm people, period, than it has to help people. That's why we have something like the racial wealth gap, because that wealth initially was generated as a result of free labor, slavery, chattel, right? That was capitalism. And capitalism now still dictates that there must be winners and losers, right? And this whole idea of shareholders means that we look at capitalism as a system by which we extract resources rather than a system where we value each other enough to share resources, because capitalism is about competition, right? And there is something called healthy competition, and then there's the rest, right? So capitalism in and of itself is a tool. Yes, I get that. But we have to understand historically how capitalism has been used against so many more people than it has helped. So to just make a blanket statement that capitalism is a good system, again, misses the mark and misses the point for why a contract at all or a plan at all for Black America is an important conversation. They talk about redlining, which we all know about, and then they talk about qualifications for loans. So I'll read this and then I have some questions. So they talk about the racial wealth gap, and then they say that, Although the black population is roughly 13.4% of the nation, approximately only 3% of loans and credit are given to black people, whether for credit cards, home mortgages, or black-owned businesses. In addition, only 1% of banks are black-owned or led, right? And then they have some bullet points of things that they want to see. Rates on black loans federally and from banks to be the same average rates as for whites. Again, equality is not equity. Equity is what closes the gap. Equality maintains the gap, even if everybody's moving forward, right? Then they say for qualified black Americans, they want the Federal Reserve to allow one-time interest-free loan for home ownership. The Federal Reserve currently provides corporations with free or 1% loans and is flooding the market with liquidity. Instead of it all going to prop up the stock market, they wanted to help create black family wealth through property ownership. So qualified, what does that mean, right? That's tricky. On the surface, that makes a lot of sense, but how do we outline those qualifications? By what criteria must an African American present to a bank or the Fed to say I'm qualified, right? That's been part of the issue. You know what I'm saying? Like these federal policies that have on the surface sought to close the gaps have in practice hurt us more than they've helped us. A great example is the GI Bill, right? I'm not saying that that was free money, but what it was a set of resources to help go to school, to help buy homes, and in that sense, give men at that time who have served in the armed forces and defended whatever liberties we have, a way to engage and be enfranchised in the economy, in the markets, right? But less than 2% of all of the GI Bill money went to black GIs. Now, there's nothing in the legislation that says it should not go to people of color, but the way the resources were distributed was a cultural decision, not a legislative decision, right? So how do we ensure that a policy or even, an initiative like a one-time interest-free loan from the Federal Reserve gets to the people who need it the most, right? Great idea, but without that being flushed out, and it's not flushed out anywhere in this document, it becomes something that could perpetuate the inequality rather than close those gaps, right? They talk about baby bonds, which is classic Derek Hamilton, where upon birth, children in low-income families get a bond of $1,000 that then grows. Now, here's what's interesting about that and why it's kind of dangerous. I'll read you what they say. The baby bonds will provide every child born into lower wealth families with accounts that start at $1,000 and would continue to be funded by the government based on family wealth up to $46,500 as proposed by Senator Booker, Cory Booker, and Representative Ayanna Pressley. Accounts to be managed by the Treasury and use of funds restricted to asset enhancing actions such as buying homes, starting businesses, and funding education. Does anybody remember the Freedmen's Bank? Like, this is not without precedent. The Freedmen's Bank was the bank that happened during Reconstruction era that Frederick Douglass became the first African-American chairman of any bank. It was the Freedmen's Bank. And because that bank was so focused on and trusted by Black America at that time, a lot of us put our resources in the bank, and those monies were mishandled at the federal level by the people put in charge by Congress to manage the money. And as a result, there was a loss in, I can tell you exactly the number, $65 million in today's money, right? So that was black wealth that just evaporated at that time. And that's partly how we get the $19 trillion reparation number, because we account for lost wages during slavery, which has been estimated at between 5 and 8 trillion. The market value of slavery at 9.3 trillion. The Freedmen's Bank losses, and this is all in today's money, $65 million. And job market discrimination, meaning the money we've lost as a result of not being able to get jobs because of how we're perceived, at 1.6 trillion. That all equals about 19 trillion. But how, I mean, we don't go to the doctor like that just culturally, because of things like Tuskegee. So why should we trust the federal government to take care of our money when it historically has not? Again, I don't understand why that historical context is not present in this piece. I'm going to play something and then we'll talk about the next section. Yeah.
Ancestors. Andre Barrett Sr.,
We have some more ancestors. Andre Barrett Sr., Ashe.
Tarasha Hunter,
Tarasha Hunter, Ashe.
Mamie Francis Hunter,
Mamie Francis Hunter, Ashe.
James Hunter,
James Hunter, Ashe.
Vanessa Barrett.
And Vanessa Barrett, Ashe. We'll always take time to remember who we are by remembering our ancestors, for sure. So I talked about a little bit of the finance and black opportunity sections. I'm going to skip a little bit of the judicial and policy reform and really focus on the fact that they want to ban all private prisons and have reinstitute the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, things like that. So that's pretty solid. No real concerns there. The next section is they want to amend the 13th Amendment to make sure that slavery is banned, period, even in the context of a crime, right? So the way the 13th Amendment is written, it has a clause. It says, I can't remember the exact wording, but it says something to the effect that slavery, except for as punishment for a crime, right, is illegal. And so they want to get that clause out of there and abolish slavery in any form, period. And they also then want to put the burden of proof on those who are in non-compliance of racialized behaviors and profiting off of racism, as opposed to the people who are claiming that they have been impacted by racism, right? So here's the next section is police reform, and it's fairly robust. There's a lot there. They're talking about body cams. They're talking about mandatory dashboard and body cams. They're talking about police union issues, federal laws about police misconduct, and the very first point, though, is referencing qualified immunity, and they want that to be eliminated, right? And so in everything, I mean, it's probably about, I didn't count them, but it's at least 20 bullet points here, right? And they all deal with issues specific to incidents that have led to the state-sanctioned murder of African Americans in the streets and on our, handsets, phones, TVs, things that we've seen. And that's important, right? Qualified immunity and the elimination of qualified immunity is absolutely important. But what they don't get to in all of these bullet points are two of the main cases that allow these things to happen. And the first is Tennessee versus Garner, where the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution talks about deadly force and deadly force being appropriate to prevent a suspect from fleeing, or if the officer has a good faith belief of danger, right? That's Tennessee versus Garner. That was established there. So an officer can use deadly force if a suspect is fleeing, and we saw that there. Walter, I'm sorry, I can't remember his name. I'm apologizing to his family and his memory. I want to say Walter Scott was running away from the police and was shot in the back, right? So that's Tennessee versus Garner, Fourth Amendment. A suspect is fleeing, and the police then is authorized to use deadly force, right? Unarmed, running away, but you can use deadly force. And then the other is Graham versus Connor, and that dealt with objective reasonableness, right? Objective reasonableness. That means my belief being the key word. And I know my cousin Daniel, my brother Conway, we talk about this all the time, but they're former police officers. But, objective reasonableness, I'm stumbling because it's like an absurd concept to me. But I can objectively and reasonably believe that I am in danger and am under no obligation as the person with the gun, especially in the context of an unarmed person, to do anything by way of de-escalation. Right? And if I believe means you don't have to have proof. If I believe that I am in danger, then I have the authorization to use deadly force. Right? Amadou Diallo, Sean Grant, Philando Castile, all these folks, Sandra Bland. Now, here's what's crazy about the idea of belief. That, again, does not get addressed in this very narrowly defined document. Belief, one, needs no burden of proof. Two, it's always informed by socialization. Always informed by socialization, right? I grew up in a Christian home. So I, as an adult, early in my life, was a Christian. Not because I chose to be a Christian, but because that's how I was socialized. I believed in this because that's what I was taught was right to believe in, right? So imagine a place like the United States where racial ideas and beliefs abound and are everywhere, right? And they say that if you are a certain skin color, you have access to more and better things. And if you are another skin color, then you don't have access to more and better things, right? You don't deserve, in many cases, access. And it also says, beyond access, that if you look a certain way, you are safe. And if you look another way, you're not safe, right? Now, define that how you want, right? Because there are Appalachian white folk who don't necessarily get that skin privilege in their domain. But if they move to New York or Columbus, Ohio, you know, all of a sudden, that privilege is there. That doesn't mean they're any less poor, right? But it's this concept, it's this ideal, right, of racial privilege. And that concept, that ideal, leads to the belief that people deserve things where other people don't, that some people are safe where other people are not safe. So if I'm a white cop and I've been socialized in these beliefs, right, and I am in the context of an engagement with a black suspect because of my belief system, because of how I've been socialized, I absolutely believe that that person is more dangerous, even if they're unarmed, than somebody in a similar situation that looks like me. That's why this case law, this case precedent, is so important to have been addressed in this context. And the fact that it's not, again, is another hole in this document that makes me think that they're not really trying to work for what they say they're trying to work for, right? Because there are a lot of smart people who have been working on this, and this is too much, this is too large an omission. This is too important to the whole idea of police and social justice reform for it to have been missed. The cases are Tennessee versus Garner, Fourth Amendment of the Constitution that says deadly force is appropriate to prevent a suspect from fleeing, or if the officer has a good faith belief of violence to himself, fellow officers, or the community, right?
Ancestor.
Okay, we got another ancestor.
Charlotte May Olden.
Charlotte May Olden. Ashe, oh. And in the other case is Graham versus Connor, objective reasonableness, right? That substantiates that belief. So we not only have to get rid of qualified immunity, we also have to repeal the damage that Connor versus Garner and Graham, Tennessee versus Garner and Graham versus Connor have done to make sure that the police officers do not have legal grounds to commit some of the acts of violence and murder that they have committed against a lot of people, not just black people, but disproportionately against black people, right? Those are key legislative or policy precedents that need to be addressed in order for us to get what we want to get out of police reform. I won't read through the rest of this, but I did think it was interesting that they say that there must be de-escalation training, continuation of training, and any police officer who discharges their weapon 5 or more times must go back to the police academy. That seems like common sense stuff that you should have anyway, but the fact that it might not be there, brings some, again, utility. But again, if we're not addressing those big cases, Tennessee versus Garner and Graham versus Connor, then this has no legs, right? The next section is entertainment industry reform and reparations. And throughout the document, they've been using the 13.4% as a reference because African Americans are 13.4% of the population. But here, for some reason, they pull 20%, right? They say licensing of public airwaves to broadcast networks such as NBC, Fox, CBS, and ABC must require black-produced content equal to 20% of the total content on the network as measured by time. So why is 13.4% important in some cases, and now we hit 20% in this particular case? There's no justification for that number. It's just there, right? I'm not saying I disagree with it, but again, I'm talking about consistency and really making something that's clear, plain for people to understand. And then, there's nothing here that suggest a way to enforce compliance when they say that mandatory funding of black studios by the largest Hollywood studios, record companies, and television studios and networks to compensate from for years of lack support, stereotyping, and damage to black culture. Here's another issue I have with the document. If the argument from a capitalistic standpoint is that reparations happen and everything is cool, then why are we now begging or demanding, that folks pay for something that one would think we could pay for ourselves? Again, I'm not against reparations, and I'm not even against studios, contributing to building, studios specific to black content. I'm not against that in theory, but I need there to be a clear line to how these things actually make America better for black people, period, right? Because the folks who own MGM and started that are just like Tyler Perry. Even though Tyler Perry had absolutely more to overcome, right? There are only going to be so many people who have the wherewithal to build successful businesses, period, point blank. Now, I agree that everybody should have the opportunity to build a business and fail and be successful at business, right? So you get no argument there from me. But on what grounds do we, get this money, and what do we do with it, and who controls all of that, right? This sounds to me like Ice Cube and some other folks are just like, we got the raw end of the stick, and instead of using the money that we've made because we've still been successful in the game, we want somebody else to pay for something. Like, it just rings hollow to me, right? Again, not anti-reparations. I'm not anti-equity in any context, but this section particularly rings hollow because it assumes that we have no agency, and we absolutely have agency. I'm in my basement talking to you right now because I had enough agency to figure something out, right? It is not the same as a network. It is not the same as folks who have millions of dollars in backing, right? But there are things that we can do to begin to build our own stuff, right? So, again, that rings a little inauthentic to me. Here's the part that really bothers me. And I think it's interesting that the artistic part and then the part about black responsibility are right together. So let's go back to what Derek Hamilton said in the preface. He said, this contract rejects the racist and unsubstantiated rhetoric that ignorance, so-called grit, and personal responsibility are the sources of racial disparity, along with the accompanying neoliberal paternalism model in which government attempts to coerce or incentivize insinuated defective black people to behave accordingly and make better decisions, right? He's arguing against respectability politics. And then, just 8 pages later, in the Black Americans' Responsibility piece, I read this last week, it says, we must become better citizens who are more productive at all levels of American society, as if we have not been productive, as if we have not been historically engaged civilly. I mean, during Reconstruction, and it's later in this piece, over 2,000 formerly enslaved people were engaged civilly enough to become mayors, to become congressmen, to become members of the House of Representatives, to sit on boards and be enfranchised of that 10 or 15-year space of Reconstruction. So there has never been a time in America when we've had the opportunity to be engaged and enfranchised that we were not. Never been a time. So they contradict themselves within 8 pages several times, right? And then they say, for all Americans, completion of rehabilitation programs for at least 28 days for first offenses for illegal drug use or possession, and failure to complete results equals an imprisonment. That's a troubling statement, because at the end of the context paragraph, it says, a new pride must develop with these new opportunities, and we must fight against negativity, frustration, hopelessness, depression, alcoholism, drug abuse, crime, and violence, as if those are issues of our own making just because, right? Again, drugs are bad, right? But the criminalization of a self-medicating process is worse, right? If we don't have access to the resources to help us deal with the trauma that continually attacks our psyche as a result of racism, racial wealth gap, all of these things that we know exist in American society, then we are criminalized for trying to deal with it on our own. And then you're going to tell me that it's my fault? Like, that's what this is saying. It's a super class-based argument that has no place in really doing the work of healing and repairing Black America and America at large. We can't approach people who are in pain with the mentality that the pain is caused by them, themselves, against themselves, and expect them to trust us to help them to be better. That's why no attempt to repair America has worked, because the perception has always been we're helping people that can't help themselves, and they can't help themselves because some way, shape, or form, they are at fault for their own problems. That's essentially what this says. They have a whole part called the case for Neo Reconstruction that, again, assumes that we don't have the agency we need to do the work we need to do. Again, reparations, absolutely helpful. There are other federal policies that would absolutely be helpful, but you cannot assume that there's nothing that we can do on our own, by ourselves, for ourselves right now, right? I was in a conversation yesterday with Black Columbus, and we were talking about youth gun violence. And I got tired of hearing folks on that call talk about needing money from predominantly white organizations, corporations, institutions in order to do the work we need to do for ourselves, by ourselves, because we needed to do it. That's like me looking at my beautiful Black child and saying, oh, she's messing up. And then I go to JP Morgan Chase and ask for a grant to help my child, right? Would there be things that I could access with those resources? Absolutely. But should I not do that work until JP Morgan Chase gives me the money? Absolutely not. It doesn't make any sense. So either we claim the power that we have and we use our agency in as much as we can to begin the work and to continue the work that needs to be done, or we sit idly by while we lose our youth because we're waiting on white institutions to give us the okay to do the work we know we can do for ourselves. What are we going to do, right? You can't have it both ways. You can do the work and compel support, but if you wait on the support to do the work, you cannot then claim that the kids are just, they're bad because they're bad. They're bad because we didn't engage them. That's our fault. That's the adults' fault, period. Now, I don't care how you look. I don't care how you present. If American adults do not engage American youth, then the youth will do what young people will do. They will find belonging elsewhere. And if we don't provide opportunities and resources for them to engage in a way that we think makes sense for our society, for our culture, then they will find ways to engage in ways that make sense for them, that often won't be aligned with how we think. That's why for Black American kids, I think we need to be very specific about how we educate them culturally, historically, spiritually, and have a rites of passage process, right? By doing that, and I talked about this in past talks, by doing that, we eviscerate this false notion of a generation gap, and we make sure that our kids know that they are loved and valued and know who they are as a result. I guarantee you, once these children know who they are because we've told them who they are, decisions and outcomes change. I know that because I've done that work. My father does the work in his church, First African Presbyterian. They have a cultural education and rites of passage program, and 100% of those kids have graduated high school and gone on to college and start businesses and become, quote unquote, to use the language of this document, productive members of their society, right? We're hitting the end, but I just want to hit one more big point. They talk about economic impact, they talk about education, but the last troubling part of this, and again, I hope you read it, is the part about jobs. It's called, the part about jobs, because I'm trying to find the language. before I get to jobs real quick, 2 more minutes. They talk about preserving the black family, and they say, I'm going to read exactly what they're saying. Any agenda that sincerely seeks to promote the best interests of the African American community must strive to restore the black family unit of man, woman, and children. Whose language is that? Why is that specific to man, woman, and child when our culture now has become absolutely more open and inclusive of same-sex couples? And economically speaking, and this is an economic document, Brookings Institute, and they quote Brookings later in that paragraph, but Brookings Institute has found that 2-parent households are more economically stable regardless of the gender makeup of the couple. And so if you're talking about economic stability, why bring the genderized part into it? People believe what they believe. Like, I get that. You can believe whatever you want to believe. But if you're thinking holistically about Black America, then you have to be inclusive, right? There are many same-sex couples that make up or are a part of Black America. And what you just did with that language is leave them out. And that is troubling because there are too many instances where Black LGBTQ plus folks are left out on the margins and not brought in. And then we wonder why we don't get the support for things that we want to at the levels we need to, because we're not being inclusive of our own folks, right? And this is not our language. Historically, from an Afrocentric perspective, we've always been inclusive of everyone in our community, right? So this is not culturally relevant or competent language here. And then lastly, the American Jobs Pact, AJP, is the part I was looking for. And they have some bullet points. They want the contract to be an example of how systematic change and rethinking of American institutions can help benefit everyone, right? This is absolutely classist language. They say they want to force, they literally use the word force, students to learn discipline, the discipline of attendance, or risk losing their ability to participate in the program. They want to force kids to learn discipline and be in attendance. Like, what does that even mean? Right? Again, that's so tone deaf. If I have grown up in a context where my family historically has had to use public resources to survive, and I've never seen mom or dad get up in the morning, go to work, come home, be with the family, get up in the morning, go home, go to work, come home. If I've never seen that by way of work ethic, how do you expect me to just know it just 'cause? I can't know it. I've never seen it, right? So why are we having expectation of an assumed lower income class that aligns exactly with the racialized perceptions of Black people, period, of being lazy? That's why this document bothers me. That's why I don't think this document can work, because the foundational aspect of the document is anti-Black, because the language is not helpful, it's harmful. There are a lot of people who will read this and agree with the substance of a lot of what's going on and not have the historical context that allows them to see how this can hurt us more than it can help us. So I hope you read it so that way you can be informed. And I would love to continue the conversation with you. You can hashtag Drumversations on Twitter and keep the conversation going. I will respond. I would love to know your thoughts. Hit up the website, marklomaxii.com. You can check out all the stuff we have. 45 albums now have been released. And Ruth and I are about to do a new episode of the podcast, so be on the lookout for that. I hope you have a great weekend. Next week, we're going to talk about plans that I think are more culturally relevant and aligned to really help us move forward, both at the macro in terms of America at large, but specifically on issues that pertain to Black America. Thanks, and have a great weekend. I'm going to play us out. Oh, I dropped my pen. Do, 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 do. Peace.